When we think about the ways in which white Southerners tried to re-enslave black people after the Civil War, one of the most important topics is the convict lease system. That linked black people and the lack of freedom, their labor, and the imprisonment system in a very powerful way. We know that Jim Crow laws were put into place and segregation laws were put into place in part to imprison young black men, and often women, and then make them work for the state.
You know, I think it's important that many historians will tell you that post-Civil War, during the Reconstruction period, African Americans were doing well. They were being elected to positions, and surprisingly well, and alarmingly well. And that threat to wealth and power and prominence resulted in a harsh response. We don't quite have a true appreciation for the people who were enslaved and their skill set. You had blacksmiths, artisans, people who had very good skills. They could build, they could measure, they could do all these things. They did the work, so they had the skills. And post-Civil War, what you found were people who realized, we don't know how to do that. Our slaves, which now is not the proper word, the people we enslaved were the ones with all those skills, the ones who could do it. So what you also found was that with that reality, there was a high incentive then to brutalize people or come up with new ways to re-enslave, to try to get that work for free again, because my goodness, if you paid working wages for some of these skills, it would be quite costly.
14th Amendment was passed. It defined citizenship, and it guaranteed equal protection for citizens. But there was a loophole in the 14th Amendment, and that was unless they were incarcerated.
You couldn't hold anyone in slavery unless it was due to the commission of a crime. So they just made up crimes just to re-enslave people. Totally fabricated crimes, or things we wouldn't consider crimes.
So in 1868, Alabama passed the first Vagrancy Act. Other states followed. And what the Vagrancy Act said was that the state of Alabama has the right to arrest you if you are not doing something, working at that moment, or have papers to say that you have a contract for work or something. And if you can't produce that, then the state of Alabama had the right to arrest you for vagrancy.
Right after the Civil War, the white owners of the land, the former slave owners, couldn't borrow any money. You know why? They didn't have any collateral. The slaves were free. They left the farm, they'd gone to town. So they had to devise a way to put the blacks back into a position of servitude. So they would arrest them, convict them, fine them. They couldn't pay the fines because they had no jobs. So they sold the fine, the money, the fine, to the miner, the mine owner, and he became his charge, and he had to work out the fine that the coal mine owner paid for him. So he went in the mine and he worked for 2 or 3 years, and by the time he had worked out that $10 fine and court costs, he was dead.
It's all designed to imprison a person, to put a person in jail. You come with any excuse. You can extend it any way you want to just justify incarcerating a person. And once that person's in there, you throw away the keys.
You see young black men and women being imprisoned for very small minor charges, just hanging on the street corner, not having a proof of employment. That would often earn them jail time in anywhere from 60 days to 6 months of what they called hard labor. That labor was free, if not very, very inexpensive for the municipality or the city or the state to build out a public infrastructure, to lay roads, to clear fields, to raise crops.
It's a simple money-making enterprise for local governments, and that was prevalent throughout the whole state. Really a sad, sad situation.
In some real sense, the city of Birmingham is built on convict labor.
Somebody figured out you can make a lot of money if somehow the coal mines had to pay the state for these prisoners. And when it was determined just how much money could be made or could be derived from these prisoners, you had a whole new mindset all of a sudden that came into play.
At that time, the state of Alabama, of course, after the war, was very poor. It had always been a poor state, but once the slave property is eliminated, the state's budget before the Civil War depended on taxes from slaves. That was the main property that people had, and they paid taxes on that. So when slavery is abolished in the 13th Amendment, the state of Alabama had even less money by far than they had before. So they need some income, and at the same time, corporations, anybody who's looking to hire, is looking for as much controlled labor as they can find. They want to, and believe they're entitled to, recreate a system as close to slavery as they can get. And so the Vagrancy Act is that.
The convict lease system was not simply an effort by the state to secure inexpensive labor. The convict lease system was also a way for large corporations like mines to benefit from the labor of young black men who were imprisoned. The convict lease system was in effect to create a large employment workforce that could be used by the state or by a mine or a large industry, and literally allowed those organizations to have a labor force that cost them very, very little and that was supervised at a very, very high rate. Yeah, the convict lease system it had strong echoes of slavery.
I mean, imagine if you'd had free labor, then all of a sudden you have to pay people, and that's going to come out of your pocket, your wealth is threatened, your farm is threatened. If you had to pay them what they were worth, that would severely hamper your dominance and your power and your money.
The state was involved in mining.
Well, no, the state wasn't involved in that.
How to phrase that?
The state
prison labor.
They leased the men in prison, and that was a joke. Jeff and I'd be walking down the street. Police would stop us. How much you got in your pocket? Nickel. How much you got?
Yeah,
Dime. You're under arrest for vagrancy. You ain't got enough money. You go before the judge, gives you a 6-month sentence.
Yep.
Tennessee Coal and Iron Company, TCI, before you became U.S. Steel, would lease us. Now you talk about horrendous.
Shotguns.
A slave owner had every reason to feed you.
Right.
Because he invested in it. And he wanted you alive.
To work.
He wanted you alive to pick.
Cotton.
And to produce what? Children. So he could have them
More
too.
slaves.
Yeah.
The corporations don't have an investment in those workers. They're prisoners, which means they don't have any rights. They can't move without permission. You are utterly controlled by the corporations. And they have no incentive to feed you or do anything else that they don't want to do. They generally got a budget for the month for food and that sort of thing. But there was no incentive for them even to spend that whole budget on feeding the prisoners. There was no oversight or anything. So they have no interest in the health and well-being of those prisoners.
When you were property, somebody else couldn't abuse your property. You'd have to pay retribution if you killed a slave. If something happened, it cost you money. They had value. But in this real, early stage of cruel re-enslavement, you could kill as many as you wanted. You could do whatever you wanted. Nobody was going to come after you because you destroyed their property.
Anything you did that they decided was an infraction, whether it was looking the wrong way at a white supervisor, or whether it was taking too long to do something, or no matter what it was, then they were entitled to add time on to your sentence, and they did. They would add on weeks, months, years.
There was very little to eat. You had very little rest. You had early hours, and you worked all day until you couldn't see anymore.
Prison conditions were horrendous. Many of these prisoners died working on railroads, working in mines.
These people had no rights, so they just disappeared.
There's an old abandoned mine in Prattville, Alabama, that has a number of unmarked graves of black miners, convict leased laborers who died working in that mine and were buried on the mine property. And their graves are still there.
The way the system finally ended in Alabama was that in some of the mines in Jasper, in Walker County, one of the prisoners fell into a vat of boiling something and was boiled to death. It became known, I think it was maybe a progressive reformer, like a Julia Tutwiler maybe, who found out about it and this and that and the other, and finally there was a lot of pressure to end the practice, and so it was outlawed. Alabama was the last state to outlaw it.
We were the last state to abolish the convict lease system. Florida came before Alabama, and Florida had abolished the convict lease system 5 years before Alabama did. See, that's what you have to go by. It's what the books say happened, if you get my drift. And then somebody else, that's the reason I said you must get somebody to start telling the story from the perspective of the victims. And see, the perspective of the victim would say World War II, not 1928, if you get my point. That's when the state outlawed it, but didn't say that's when it stopped. Two different things, very different.
In many ways, if you were driving down a road in the Deep South in the early 1900s and you would see young black men hoeing lines of cotton, you might think that the clock hadn't changed from 1865. The current crisis of mass incarceration, how deeply it affects black families, particularly young black men, it's not a modern phenomenon. That's a product of decades of prejudice and policies that has denied black people, particularly young black men, the most basic and most fair access to a judicial system. The convict lease system, its legacy might very well be the current crisis of mass incarceration and the lack of proper legal efforts and attention and high-level lawyering for the very poor, for the marginalized. The convict lease system was almost as close to slavery as you could get to without fully being enslaved.
That's why we need somebody to tell the story from the perspective of the victims.